We previously did a video putting forward candidates for who might be the best Prime Minister we never had, and we thought it was such an interesting subject, we might as well do a series of videos on each candidate, putting out why they should have been a Prime Minister, why they shouldn't have been, why they didn't become Prime Minister, and what would have happened if they did become Prime Minister. And this will apply for as many candidates as we can think up with, as the only real defining thing that they had to do to be on this list will be they had to be real people. Apart from that, we can have a lot of people on it, so it's going to be quite a long series of videos, but a very interesting one. Austen Chamberlain is probably one of the least known, most important British politicians there has been. He is the first proper leader of the Conservative Party never to become Prime Minister, and he was only briefly leader. Had only a small number of things happened. Had, for example, Lloyd George's coalition with the Conservatives collapsed a couple of months before it did. Had Andrew Bonar Law's cancer developed quicker, or had Stanley Baldwin not have prospered so much and not have been what was to become the 1922 the backbench Conservative rebellion against the Lloyd George government, had any of these things not have occurred exactly when they did occur, he would have become Prime Minister in either 1922 or 1923, and he would have then gone on to be a very interesting person. He was an interesting person. I mean, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer before when he was in his mid-30s, mid-40s, about 1900s, in the Balfour government. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was a relatively young man. He served as Foreign Secretary and Chancellor again during the war and after the war, the First World War, and he was probably the most well-prepared person not to become Prime Minister, or certainly one of them who never became Prime Minister. So if, for example, then the scenario we lay out is that either Andrew Bonar Law dies before he did, say 1921, and Austen Chamberlain is leader, then the same thing would occur with Stanley Baldwin, the same rebellion in 1922, which would have then led to an immediate general election, which would have probably resulted in a Conservative majority, and Austen Chamberlain would become Prime Minister. So if we assume then that Austen Chamberlain becomes Prime Minister in late 1922, what would he have pushed ahead with? Well, he would have probably appointed Stanley Baldwin as Chancellor, as Bonar Law did. He would have probably been slightly less pro-appeasement. He would have been, well, although this is in the 1920s, not the 1930s, he was in the 1930s a leading advocate of aggressive action against Germany. He was one of these people on the same wing as Churchill in that respect. So had he been Prime Minister in the 1920s, he might have done more to assure that Germany did not become the threat it later did. It might have been, in that respect, quite successful, although in other respects he wouldn't have been. For example, he was absolutely very firm on the issue of tariffs. He wanted to impose a protectionist trade policy to protect British trade against foreign competition, which was something that his father had come up with in the 1880s, 1890s, which might not have been very successful. It was a negative policy. It was protectionist policies in general tend to be isolationist policies, and it would have probably resulted in greater tensions with France and Italy and other European countries. And then, of course, the other main factor would be that Austen Chamberlain was not the kind of forward-thinking Conservative that Stanley Baldwin was. Well, he wore a monocle a lot of the time. It's in the 1920s, and he looked like a Victorian gentleman, despite the fact that he wasn't that old, and despite the fact that his father was a sort of middle-class businessman who became a very successful industrialist and later went on to become mayor. His father, he effectively had his life handed to him on a silver platter. He was effectively not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but certainly developed quite a strong silver spoon in his mouth later on in his career. So he would not have been as politically tactful as Stanley Baldwin was. So it's perfectly feasible that there had been a successful Conservative election in 1922. By 1927 or 1926, particularly 1926, the general strike, which he might not have been able to not negotiate, but it might not have came out of as well as Stanley Baldwin came out of it. It's highly likely that in 1927 there would be either a Labour minority or majority government, with Ramsay MacDonald as Prime Minister, which would probably then last through until 1931. Which might then see like in real life, a national government come forward. But of course Neville Chamberlain would probably prosper more as well. He was actually a junior minister in the Baldwin government, and then later on became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1930s. He might have become Conservative leader 5 or 6 years before he actually did. So Neville Chamberlain would have assumed the premiership earlier, and Winston Churchill would not have prospered as well as he did. Possibly he might not have become Chancellor in the 1920s. Stanley Baldwin would have held that position, but he might have still become Prime Minister if war was unavoidable, as some historians debate, in 1940, and then things would have carried on as they really did.